Welcome to the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore and the Italian International Institute for Political Study, ISPI, joint webinar on China in the Middle East. Previously, at MEI, we have been talking about China in the Middle East, looking at the security angle, at the digital Silk Road and at the friction between China and the United States and how countries from Israel to Singapore would have to navigate. Also, we have been discussing extensively on the relationship between Iran and China. Today, I'm very pleased and delighted to have a very distinguished speaker that will address the relationship with China and the Gulf state looking at a different angle. We are not talking about energy security. We are looking at green economy, health diplomacy, social and religious cooperation, ongoing cooperation, as well as different perspective and different relationship with countries like Russia, India, in the Middle East. Just a couple of suggestions. We will have only one question to our presenter. So to our audience, please feel free to jump in with your question. You can do it with the Q&A function in the Zoom box, Q&A box, but please make my life easier. Just raise your virtual hand and you can ask the question directly to our speaker. And without further ado, please allow me to introduce you our first speaker, Professor Jonathan Fulton. Professor Fulton, he is based in Zayed University. He is also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he's well-known scholar. He's been written extensively on academic publication and books on China relation in the Middle East. And Jonathan, if I recall correct, you have a book that is ready and is a handbook on China-Middle East relation. And starting with your handbook, my question is if you can give a broader picture of China relationship with the Gulf, especially the overlapping part between the Gulf Vision and the Belt and Road Initiative. And then after, if you can zoom it down in the area where you are living, that is the Emirate. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alessandro, for the generous introduction, and thanks for inviting me to this interesting project. You know, to have three distinguished organizations come together, it's really cool. So, and also thanks for plugging my book, which you've written a wonderful chapter for as well. Inshallah, we'll see the book by October. It's the Routledge Handbook on China-Middle East Relations, and really just a stellar group of scholars who contributed. It's something I'm really proud of, I'm very excited about. So I like the theme of this, full steam ahead in the Gulf and looking at trends beyond energy, because I think energy is a really common way of looking at China's relations with Gulf countries. And I think it's far too narrow. Obviously, energy has been the foundation. You know, it's what started some of the relations, and or at least to make them more significant or substantial. Certainly, since 2013, that's changed a lot. And you're right to mention the Belt and Road Initiative. I think this is a major facet of what's been going on. Since 2013, when BRI was announced, we've seen a big shift in China's regional policy. And I think this shift recognizes just a fundamental historical fact that the Gulf region has always been about more than energy. You know, long before anybody discovered hydrocarbons here, the Gulf was a major transit route. And whether you look at it as part of the Middle East or West Asia, or however you want to designate it, the Gulf links to a lot of really important regions around the world, whether you're going to Africa, to the Mediterranean, or South Asia, or the Indian Ocean region. The Gulf is a major region in its own right. And I think what we've seen with the Belt and Road Initiative is a lot of what China's doing in the Middle East is centered here. I think the Arabian Peninsula is the anchor of China's Middle East ambitions. So it's about more than energy. And of course, like I said, connectivity is, I think, what the Gulf offers, what the Arabian Peninsula offers for extra regional powers. And connectivity is what the Belt and Road Initiative is all about. So when you look at where China is going to be expanding its or deepening its footprint in the Middle East, I think you want to locate those countries that have the most to offer in terms of regional interconnectivity. And that's why if any of you have seen me on these many webinars I've been doing the past, well, for the duration of COVID so far, there's been a lot of attention paid to the China-Iran relationship, this partnership that's been, I think, exaggerated tremendously over the years. And in March, when China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi made a very big visit to the region, he stopped in Iran. And of course, they announced that this partnership, this comprehensive strategic partnership was being signed off on. And this seemed to really get a lot of people nervous. But what wasn't really noticed, or at least not to the same degree, was the next day Wang Yi, Foreign Minister Wang, came here to Abu Dhabi and announced that the UAE was going to partner with China in this vaccine manufacturing and distribution project. And I think that was, by far a more interesting part of the story. You know, China and Iran signed this partnership agreement back in January 2016, and it's taken 5 years to get it off the ground. China and the UAE signed a similar comprehensive strategic partnership in July 2018, and it's already expanded to the point that the UAE has become really, I think, China's most important regional partner. So again, one of the trends I look at going forward, which countries offer the most in terms of regional connectivity? The UAE is by far the most networked country in the Middle East. It's by far the most connected country in the Gulf. It's got this fantastic logistics, infrastructure. It's really, I think, what really we should be looking at, rather than getting caught up in the potential of a China-Iran relationship. Look at the reality of what a China-UAE relationship has been. A second big trend I'd look at is, again, looking at the BRI. And I think a lot of analysis on BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, focuses on the infrastructure, because it's something that is kind of a sexy story. You know, these massive ports and pipelines and highways and all this stuff that China's building. And of course, I understand that that is very important stuff, but it's only one part. You know, if you look at the BRI white paper that was announced in 2015, China announced 5 cooperation priorities, and the first one was policy coordination. It wasn't infrastructure development, it's policy coordination, working together on political issues of shared importance or interests. And again, I think when the global economy took this massive COVID-inspired hit, there was a lot of punditry that said, well, that's the end of BRI in a lot of parts of the world because everybody's economy is so weak. And what you've seen in the Middle East and the Gulf, and especially in the UAE, is that's not been the case at all. If anything, you've seen that policy coordination element really amp up, and China's been working a lot more closely on things like, as you mentioned, Alessandro, in the introduction, the Digital Silk Road Initiative and the Health Silk Road Initiative, 2 of the maybe lesser known components of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Digital Silk Road, the DSRI, has been a big part of what China's doing in a lot of Gulf countries, Saudi and the UAE and Qatar, well, Saudi and the UAE primarily. As those 2 countries, you see in Saudi where they're trying to develop this NEOM project, this new AI-driven city, in Dubai trying to create a smart city that's driven by digital economy and fintech and AI and all of this stuff that's happening in the region. This lines up very neatly with China's DSRI. So I think that's a big trend to watch, is just how are these things going to shape the relationship going forward. And again, the UAE, I think, is a very important part of that, because you've seen with the vaccine diplomacy, with the projects that the 2 countries have been cooperating on and distributing the vaccine across the Middle East, it does really seem to be where China's footprint is the deepest in the region. And it goes beyond vaccines to the components that make it up. So whether it's AI or digital technologies, all the parts that are important in developing this the nuts and bolts of how the vaccine is put together. And I know you're talking about soft power and green economies, but I'm a political scientist. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about politics, geopolitics. I think the third trend that I'm looking at, obviously, is you can't really consider China in the Gulf, China in the Middle East, without considering China in the US. And I think Washington and Beijing have both come to this conclusion that great power competition is defining their relationship at this point. And I think in many regions around the world, the China-US relationship seems to be inherently competitive. But the Gulf doesn't necessarily, that's not necessarily the case. There are a lot of policy areas where there is room for policy coordination, where the two sides don't necessarily bump up against each other. They seem to have a lot of interests in common. So if you talk to folks around the Gulf, nobody is really interested in being a theater of great power competition. You see a lot of countries or a lot of leaders that want to try to maintain a balanced approach to cooperate with both the US and China. How sustainable or possible that is in the future, it's hard to say, because I think, again, a lot of this gets decided in Beijing and Washington. But I do think that there's still an opportunity for these two sides to work together in the Gulf to try to achieve a more stable region. So I'll stop here. I know there's going to be a lot of discussion. So again, just thanks for the opportunity to join you today, and look forward to any questions, and I can discuss issues like China's soft power in the Gulf if that comes up in the discussion period.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Of course, you roped in the elephant in the room, great power competition. If we look at the great power competition, for example, Chinese soft power in some area of the world has been questioned several times. And even we are still debating if you can use nice definition for Chinese soft power, while most of the time it's been considered hard power used softly. But this gives me the opportunity to introduce our second speaker, that is Dr. Jacqueline Armijo. She currently based in Shanghai as a visiting professor at the New York University Shanghai campus. She's a scholar of Islam in China, and she has taught in very prestigious university from Cornell, Stanford, and in your university also, Jonathan, in Zayed University in UAE. She's been in Qatar University and Asian University for Women in Bangladesh, as she's been living more than a decade in the Gulf. And as today we are focusing on China relation in the Gulf, I want to start to ask to Jacqueline a first question about Chinese footprint in the education and in the cultural relation in the area, in the region. And of course, if you can look at the growing role of Chinese Muslim diaspora, especially in the UAE. Floor is yours, Jacqueline.
Thank you. And I'd like to start by sharing my screen. If that hasn't worked, let me know.
It's working.
Okay, I'm going to begin by quickly reviewing the early trade between China and the Gulf and some of the long-term cultural impacts. I will then describe an extraordinary and massive art exhibit that took place in Qatar that built on these early ties. The next topic will be a recent major initiative to introduce Chinese language instruction in primary and secondary schools across the UAE, and more recently a similar but smaller scale one in Saudi, and how this is part of China's huge education and research soft power projects related to the Belt and Road Initiative. Finally, there'll be a brief discussion of the role of Dubai's Chinese Muslim community in facilitating China-UAE economic relations in cultural contexts. So as a historian, I'd like to start with a bit of history. It was not until about 20 years ago that scholars realized the extent to which China had this massive trade with countries of the Middle East, and especially the Gulf. It was when people based in Singapore know about the Belton shipwreck. But in this boat that was originally built in Oman and was heading back to the Middle East after picking up about 70,000 goods in Guangzhou in China, it sank off the coast of Indonesia. When it was recovered, it was realized that they had just literally tens of thousands of objects that had been created in kilns across China that were custom made for different markets in the Middle East and the Gulf. Among the many fascinating components of this discovery was the fact that although people equate the famous Chinese blue and white porcelain with the later periods, especially the Ming Dynasty, this boat's in the early 9th century. And this is one of the earliest known examples of blue and white Chinese porcelain. And as so some of you may know, the blue is from Iran. It's cobalt that has to be imported from Iran. So one of the reasons I wanted to mention this was just to give the audience an idea of just how early there were Muslims primarily traveling back and forth between the Gulf and China, and the extent to which this trade had become quite developed by the beginning of the 9th century. This is an example of the Dhow, the Omani boat that that held all of the objects. Although traders originally settled in Guangzhou on the coast, later there was a much larger community based in Quanzhou. This is the mosque in Quanzhou. This mosque is known as the Qingzhengzi in Chinese and Al-Asab Mosque in Arabic, and it was built around 1080. And this is I was just, as you can see from the mask, I was there fairly recently. And this is what's left. This is basically now a small museum of what's remaining from this mosque. They moved a traditional Chinese mosque to right next to the old one. And for those of you who have not seen a traditional Chinese mosque, this is the interior. And those of you who are native speakers of Arabic will realize that there's this very, very highly stylized form of Arabic that's developed in China over the centuries. And just in passing, there's officially 10 Chinese Muslim communities. The largest are white, and they're descendants primarily of traders who came from the Middle East and Central Asia and first settled in China primarily during the Yuan dynasty. So although I visited this mosque first back in 1981, when it was in ruins and there was no museum next door, I visited a few months ago. And right next to the mosque, the Sultan Qaboos of Oman has financed a brand new mosque, which is really quite elegant. And at this point, only used on Friday prayers. Another reason I wanted to mention Quanzhou in particular was, to this day in Quanzhou, there are still remnants of traditional Islamic architecture throughout the old parts of the city. These are examples of some of the tombstones that were from the very large Muslim community that had settled in Quanzhou. I'm now going to switch to, and this gives you an idea of the different parts of the Muslim world that these Muslim traders had come from. So I'm now going to talk about a project carried out by Zai Guoqiang, one of China's most famous artists. When Sheikh Mayasa in Qatar decided to have the first solo exhibit back around 2012, she invited Zai Guoqiang. And what she hadn't realized is that, in fact, he was the perfect person to have this first exhibit. Although he's not Muslim, he grew up in Quanzhou, and since he was a child, he understood the importance of the history of Islam in China, and he incorporated it into his work. One of the things that he did was he had local artisans in Quanzhou carve into boulders the epitaphs from these tombstones of the Muslims onto these large boulders, and then he shipped the boulders to Doha. So these are the entrance of the museum. These are close-ups of some of the examples. Another part of the exhibit, as you first enter it, are these three boats. One's Chinese, one's a Gulf fishing boat, and the others are sort of in between. But he very much wanted to recreate the sense of traveling from across the oceans, from China to the Gulf. He's known for working with gunpowder as a media. So the first thing he does is he creates this giant stencil, and then he has hundreds of volunteers sort of cut it out, and then there's different types of gunpowder he puts on top. The whole thing is covered, it's lit, it's ignited, and it's basically the images are burned into the text. This is the final example. We added some more detail and some notes. And as you can see, here's the traditional dhow, and here's a traditional Chinese trading vessel. there were several extremely large paintings as part of this project, but this is the one that was, I think, most liked by the variety of people I interviewed who went to this exhibit. And it was called 99 Horses. And it's both stunningly beautiful, but also by calling it Jojo Ma in Chinese, 99 has this idea of infinity. And of course, in Arabic, it sort of is resonant of the 99 names of God. One of the reasons I wanted to start with that exhibit is because China is now spending a lot of time promoting heritage and different forms of heritage culture and this whole idea of the historic Silk Route. But what's so interesting is what Zhai Guoqiang did. He did this well before China had developed this plan. And he also did it in a way that, you know, both Qataris and other Gulf Arabs who traveled to the region were very, very much struck by it. I had students at the time who did a lot of interviews with some of the guests. And it's so interesting for, you know, the Gulf Arabs as they entered this exhibit to really stop and ponder what it must have been like hundreds of years ago for traders from the region to go and settle in China, and then some of them passed away in China. He also did several ceremonies in which he sort of welcomed the souls of the ones who had died overseas back home to the Gulf. So the other initiative I wanted to talk about started fairly recently. It was first announced in 2017. And that is, there are now plans for, well, it's already started. Chinese is now being taught in primary and secondary schools across the UAE at about 100. And they started in 2017 with, I think, 10 schools or 11 schools. And now it's up to 100. Clearly things have been sort of been put on hold, although I think the classes are continuing, but obviously online right now. And I don't know at this point to what extent they're going to be able to expand it over the next couple of years. But as you can see, they already have a textbook. And so far it's going really well. But one of the reasons I wanted to mention this is because in other countries, China's opening institutes up around the world, and there's several in the Gulf regions, and there's 2 in the UAE. But in other countries, what China is doing is they are giving scholarships for local students to go and study Chinese in China and to get a degree program, and then they go back to their home country and start teaching primary and secondary school students. Whereas in the Gulf, specifically the UAE, China is investing a lot of their very, very, sought after Chinese language teachers specifically to the UAE to be able to offer Chinese language programs. Saudi has also started something similar, but on a much smaller basis. But one of the interesting things Saudi is working on specifically in terms of cultural, historical ties is they are doing joint archaeological projects. Among other things, they are looking for similar shipwrecks as was found in Belitung off of the coast of Indonesia. And this is an article about one of the projects, which did find some things along a Red Sea port. And as Jonathan mentioned, China very early on made it very clear that there were many different dimensions of the Belt and Road initiatives. And I think, for example, Section 5, the cooperation mechanisms, people-to-people bond, was pretty much looked over by a lot of people, but it says very clearly they're about academic exchanges, personnel exchanges, schools, scholarships, media, cultural heritage, etc. And one of the things I thought was interesting is that they also said from the very beginning, focus on epidemic information sharing and the scientific and technology exchange. For those specifically interested in China and science and the role of BRI, there was an excellent series of articles written in Nature specifically on this. But one of the things that points out was just the degree to which China has literally gone around, certainly around most of Asia. They've sent scientists and public health officials to different countries. They've literally tried to figure out what their biggest need was. Then identified scientists and research scholars in China who had those skills, set up research centers in the country with the need, sent professors to do trainings, sent local scientists to China for extensive training. they're building a foundation in terms of education and scientific research that theoretically can have extraordinary long-term impacts. And they're very much thinking in a absolute in the long term. Some of you may know both China and, for example, the UAE and Saudi, and to a certain extent, Qatar, have invested a huge amount in renewable energy. This is an interesting example of sustainable food sources. So this is a project in which Dubai and the Qingdao Saline Alkaline Tolerant Rice Research set up a test to see whether or not they could grow saltwater rice, and they basically were successful. I want to conclude with mention of the very large Chinese population in Dubai, which now is over 250,000, and the role of the Chinese Muslim community. So this is the mosque that they opened a couple of years ago. They've called it the Huafang Qingzhensi, which is the Chinese Community Mosque. And this is the Chinese Islamic Culture Center they have there, which works very hard at facilitating all sorts of cooperation between Emiratis and Chinese. I think I'll end there. Oh, actually.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. It was extremely interesting, especially the fact that you, as Jonathan, underlined the role of connectivity. Historically speaking, you mentioned it correctly, that blue and white porcelain are very famous, especially in the West now. But at the time, Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty, the Chinese still prefer Song-style celadon compared to the blue and white that was just an export product primarily for Persia, and then it moved on with Portugal and with the Dutch, with the Kraken into Europe. And this gave me the opportunity to introduce our third speaker, looking at interaction that is not only related to China and the Gulf, but also to other regional power in the area. Our third speaker is a research fellow for the Middle East Policy and the International Institute of Strategic Study, Hassan Al-Hassan. He specializes in analyzing foreign and economic relations in Asia and the Middle East. And he is completing his doctoral research thesis at the King's College London, looking at the decision-making process behind India foreign policy toward the Gulf. So this gives me the occasion, Hassan, to ask you if the friction between China and the United States in the Gulf is having other effect on other regional power, and what is especially the role in this of India, and even if we can rope in Russia. Hassan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex, for the generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be on this wonderful panel. We're clearly covering a number of very important topics. And I think your question alludes to something that's often quite missing in the debate on the Chinese role in the region and in the Middle East, which is to contextualize the Chinese role and the Chinese footprint in more than one way. I think one of the key problematic areas or aspects of for example, the media coverage and much of the commentary around Chinese presence in the region, because of the politicization of this and the I think tendency to securitize everything that China does in the region and to view it through primarily as a threatening actor, especially in the West. I think we have a tendency to look at what China does with a very myopic, for me, myopic perspective. And therefore, we often tend not to contextualize it against what other external players are doing in the Gulf region, or to look at how it fits into the strategies of the regional actors in the Gulf itself. And so what I'll start by doing is to try to bring China's economic and security footprint in the Gulf region, put it into comparative perspective against that of other external players on the one hand, and then on the other hand, try to look at how China-Gulf relations fit into the broader overarching national security objectives of the Gulf states, and more specifically on the Arab Gulf states and the GCC member states. So to begin, I think by contextualizing and comparing China's economic footprint against that of other extra-regional powers. So it's no surprise that from a trade perspective, of course, China surpasses the rest of the Asian powers and the rest of the world in terms of being the Gulf states or the Gulf region's most important trading partner, with trade, I think, reaching at about $180 billion, more or less. Now, of course, so China is, of course, the region's most important trading partner as a state, but it's not extremely far off by comparison to other Asian players. So, for example, Gulf trade with India stands at over $100 billion. So it's not that very far off. Chinese energy imports, for example, from the GCC states are obviously very important as well, but again, they're more or less comparable to those of India, Japan, and South Korea. I think where the picture starts to shift a little bit is when we look at trends in FDI, so that's foreign direct investment and lending. And here, China is even less exceptional in quantitative terms by comparison to other external powers. So to begin with, I mean, the Middle East is a minor recipient of, and not just the Gulf region, but even the broader Middle East is a minor recipient of Chinese investments. So, of course, the major caveat is that it's not easy to obtain data reliable data on Chinese foreign investments and Chinese lending, especially in the Middle East. You have what I call a double transparency deficit. So China's not on the sending end, China's not very transparent, and on the receiving end, Middle Eastern countries don't tend to be very transparent either. So that creates a data problem. But even if we were to believe the data that's out there, the data that's reported by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, for example, the Middle East is a minor recipient of Chinese investments. I think China's FDI stock in the Middle Eastern region stands at around $25 billion, according to 2018 figures, and that's about 1.3% of China's total outward FDI, and it's quite a minor figure when you look at the Middle East's share of global FDI, which stands at 3.7%. So compared to the global average, actually, China is a fairly minor investor in the region. It invests less than what the region gets in terms of the world's total outward FDI. The Middle East is also a minor recipient of Chinese lending and of Chinese credit. China's debt stock in the 9 Middle Eastern countries for which data is available only represents about 0.2% of their total GDP. By comparison, China's share of global debt stock was the equivalent of about 6% of the world's GDP. So in essence, what that means is that the Middle East is a low priority region for Chinese outward lending by comparison to the rest of the world. So on the one hand, the Middle East is a low priority destination for Chinese investments and for Chinese lending. On the other hand, China faces stiff competition as an investor and as a source of credit in the Middle Eastern region when we look at what other external players are doing. And so, for example, in 2018, China's share of the Middle Eastern region's inward FDI stock, so sort of all of the stock of investments in the Middle Eastern region, China's share stood at around 2%, which is ironically hadn't changed. I mean, so China's share stood at 2% even prior to the BRI, prior to its launch in 2012. And so the BRI, if we were to go by UN figures, does not appear to have had a quantitative impact on China's share of total investments in the region. So China is far outweighed, for example, as an investor by global and regional competitors, including the EU, especially by multiple orders of magnitude, the US and the GCC as well. That being said, the Gulf states, of course, and coming back to the Gulf region, the Gulf states are the most important recipients of Chinese investments in the Middle East. And so Chinese investments tend to be concentrated in the UAE. And that's, of course, normal, given that the UAE captures the overwhelming majority of foreign direct investments in the Middle East anyway. So China's not exceptional in that regard. It's following, merely following the regional trend. And so, of course, the UAE is the most important recipient of Chinese investments, followed by Israel, and then, of course, Saudi Arabia and Turkey as well. But there are a few other countries that generally face economic difficulties and sanctions, such as Iran, Algeria, and to a lesser extent, Egypt, that are also important recipients. That being said, and I think despite all the talk about China's investments in renewable energy, in digital infrastructure, in ports and logistics and so on, the majority of Chinese investments and contracts in the region, according to AEI data, is still concentrated in the energy sector, and is still concentrated more specifically in the hydrocarbons sector. So that continues to be, from a quantitative perspective, I think, the main area of focus for Chinese investments. The thing is that I think the reason why Chinese investments in the region tend to attract a lot of attention is because of their qualitative nature. And because of the fear that China's edge in emerging sectors and emerging technologies might end up eroding the US's and the West's North American, Western European powers or actors' global leadership in these areas. So, for example, China is emerging, of course, as an important partner for Gulf states and the areas and sectors of renewable energy, of course, under the umbrella and in digital technology and infrastructure, under the umbrella of the Digital Silk Road, in logistics, and increasingly in public health and biotechnology. So I think the qualitative nature, of course, is very worrying generally for Western policy makers. But from a quantitative perspective, China is not taking over the Middle East, let alone the Gulf region, anytime soon. I think the second way in which it would be important to contextualize China's activity and behavior in the region is from a security perspective. And I think there, it's fair to say that even by comparison to Asian players, China is a fairly late comer. And so, yes, China's joint exercises with Russia and Iran on the one hand, and with Saudi Arabia on the other, received a lot of attention. But Japan's maritime presence in the Gulf region far outweighs that of China. Japan, for example, is part of the Combined Maritime Forces. It's part of the Combined Task Force 150, which looks at maritime security outside of the Gulf. It's part of CTF 151 that looks at counter-piracy missions and operations under a US umbrella. And so Japan has been part of the maritime security architecture of the region for a very long time. India as well has long had privileged security relations with Oman, for example. It enjoys berthing privileges in Omani ports. Indian security wonks often talk about a secretive agreement that India had signed with Qatar more than a decade ago that stops just short of deploying Indian troops to Qatar. There's vigorous counterterrorism cooperation with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and an uptick in Indian defense diplomacy. We've recently seen the Indian Chief of Armed Forces visit Saudi Arabia for the first time, and have seen Indian armed forces conducting combined exercises with their Gulf counterparts. India has deployed naval assets to protect Indian tankers crossing the Strait of Hormuz following the Iranian attacks on shipping in the region. And so the takeaway here is that, yes, there is an increase in Chinese defense diplomacy and joint exercises and so on, but when compared even to other Asian actors, China is a relative latecomer to the region. I think the final contextualization, part of the contextualization exercise is to look at how relations with China fit into the GCC perspective. And I'll be quite brief here. I think it's important to keep in mind that from the GCC states perspective, and I think it makes sense to speak about the GCC as a bloc in this regard, because I think that there is a shared threat perception and a shared perception about Gulf regional security, especially vis-a-vis Iran. I think the overarching national security objectives for the GCC states is one, to internationalize Gulf regional security and to create a Gulf regional security architecture that is extremely penetrated by international actors. And I think that has become extremely pronounced or increasingly pronounced, let's say, after the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Iraq, of Kuwait, and the 1991 Gulf War. So since then, we've seen every single GCC country host foreign troops, be they American, British, French, or over the past few years, Turkish troops in Qatar. This is primarily a way of countering Iran's hegemonic potential in the region, but also allowing the smaller Gulf states a greater degree of strategic autonomy vis-a-vis other regional players as well. I think the second component of the GCC state strategy is diversifying their foreign relations and creating these overlapping webs of strategic partnerships. And we've seen that, for example, so 2006 is a landmark year. We've seen King Abdullah at the time conduct his maiden visits to China and then to India. And I think since then, we've seen and probably before that, since the end of the 1990s, really, we've seen a heated attempt a feverish attempt by the Gulf states to diversify their foreign relations. And third, to guarantee for themselves a degree of strategic autonomy, both from the US, but from other regional players as well. And here, China makes sense as a partner. From the GCC states perspective, it's a great power, one that has leverage on Iran, and one that allows the GCC states to hedge against US disengagement in the short and medium term, and US decline in the long term. So it makes sense as a partner that allows them, that allows the GCC states greater room and greater margin of autonomy vis-a-vis great and regional powers. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Definitely, I'm going to steal your definition of double transparency deficit. As you mentioned, GCC country, compared to other regions in the world, are a minor recipient of Chinese FDI. As we have been talking about present and in the past with Jacqueline, I would like to try to gaze at the crystal ball and look in what are the trends in the near future of China present in GCC, especially looking at green economy, at health diplomacy, with UAE having approved the production of Chinese vaccine, for example, in the Emirates. And this gives me the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Alessia Miguini. Prior to introduce Alessia, I would like to personally thank Alessia for making it possible the cooperation between MEI and ISPI, and also I will take the chance to thank my colleague, Dr. Clemens Chey, for working very hard in making this event possible. Dr. Alessia Miguini is a co-head of Asian Center and Senior Associate Research Fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Study, better known as ISPI. She is also an Associate Professor of Economics in the University of Piemonte Orientale, and she previously worked as Associate Economist at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva, Switzerland. I will use, as I did with Jonathan, the excuse of your book, as Alessia, you just published a book, Money and Might Along the Belton Road. And using what you found in this book related to green economy, health diplomacy. Can you tell us what are going to be the trend of China inroad in the GCC in the Gulf? And I don't know if I can ask you this question, if it's already there, but there's been a lot of talk about Chinese digital UN. Is too early, is too premature to talk about digital UN inroad in the Gulf and then in the Middle East? Floor is yours, Alessia.
Thanks, Alessandro, for this introduction and also for organizing this seminar, this event, which I think is very timely because although I agree with the previous speakers, of course, which were contradictory a little bit with each other, Jonathan and Hassan told that, of course, China is growing its presence in the Middle East, in the GCC or Middle East, broadly speaking, but it is still a latecomer. So it's a little bit contradictory. So I would like to share with you some points taken from my own research and from my own study about China in various regions in the world, including the Middle East, which I think is becoming the very area where all the various belts and roads are finding their own way, I mean, in a comprehensive way, unlike in other regions where the Belt and Road has been developing, so Africa, Southeast Asia, or Latin America as well, or elsewhere in Central Asia. So I think the Middle East is becoming, maybe it's not yet fully developed, but is becoming the region where all the various channels within the Belt and Road are developing. And of course, also, Jacqueline said that Belt and Road is not only infrastructure. And I think this is very bizarre why especially in Europe, but also the Western countries have taken Belt and Road as being only transport infrastructure for so many years now that it's really unbelievable that all the other 4 pillars at least of Belt and Road have been neglected almost totally. While in China, since 2014, maybe not 2013, but 2014, 2015, the digital Silk Road, the Silk Road were at the center of the debate. So this is very peculiar that, you know, there are so many misperceptions about what the Belt and Road is, which is a lot of things. And what I would like to mention today, first of all, is that Belt and Road is not dying. It's not dead. You may have remembered a short but very shocking debate some months ago, earlier this year, saying from one Financial Times article that Belt and Road was actually phasing out because of the pandemic, because of the changes in, you know, foreign policies and the money given to finance Belt and Road projects. But that view was totally biased because Belt and Road is, again, not just transport, roads, railways, shipping and logistics, but it's a lot of things. And these other many things are growing, and they are growing a lot. And especially, I would focus on 3 areas where the Belt and Road, you know, action is developing quite fast. And one has already been mentioned, which is energy or green, I mean, renewable energy sector, which was in 2020 the single most important sector as a recipient of Belt and Road investment. I mean, in the middle of the pandemic, the Belt and Road was going still, and the very sector that was targeted for investments were renewable sectors. And the Middle East, especially some of the countries, of course, here, not all of them, were targeted for this. This is very important because it has to be contextualized into the long-standing efforts by some of these countries, especially United Arab Emirates, but also Saudi Arabia. They have been in place industrial development policy strategies for so many years to diversify their own economy. And renewable sectors were, of course, one of the sectors they started to look at to diversify their production structure. And so this, creates a complementarity with China's interest in improving renewable sectors, in investing in renewable sectors. And this has been very neglected, I think. So I agree with Hassan that it's still, developing, but it's going to be a major avenue for really win-win. I mean, not the Chinese way, but really in the field, the win-win benefits for this sector and for the area. So I both agree with Jonathan but also with Hassan, because this has been very important, although maybe in aggregate term it's still, minor percentage, but in sectoral term is very relevant. And here you see also that many other countries have been included in this action of renewable energy investment. Of course, there are different levels of, inclusion and interaction. There are priority partners for Belt and Road investment, both at the bilateral level, which is the, largely preferred by China, but also within so-called comprehensive partnerships, meaning a group of countries, many groups of countries where some projects are, shared and are developing. And if you have a look at the map, of course, it's not only the Gulf or the Middle East, but is a major part of the world which is being, in Beijing's eyes, targeted as a whole. And this, bear with me, I will take it up again in a minute, because I think this is very relevant to understand the narrative that China is giving to the rest of the world in terms of their, areas of foreign policy actions and the motivation for this foreign policy actions. The second, area, pillar of Belt and Road, although it's not one of the 5 major pillars included in the White Book back in 2015, it's one of the minor pillars, but very relevant because, back in 2015, when the White Book was published, of course, the Silk Road was there already. I remember during the first Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, there was a memorandum of understanding between the World Health Organization and the People's Republic of China for health cooperation along the Belt and Road. And nobody even dared to ask what this could become, Then, last year we understood that that could be a way to also, develop soft power around the world. And we all saw how many channels, how many medical equipment and vaccine and medical doctors going to many of these countries to help. But the Health Belt and Road was already there, and in the spirit and in the intention of China, of course, it was much intended to help African countries, which are much in need of health cooperation besides development cooperation to core. Of course, China has a lot of interest, economic interest in Africa, and wanted to also start this health cooperation, which now is, worldwide. It was a tool of soft power, unintended tool of soft power all over the world, and now we see how many countries have been included. So this Health Silk Road has been a major pillar and avenue of diplomacy, political diplomacy, as we are witnessing how many countries are queuing for either vaccine or other kinds of equipment. And this is a major vehicle for exerting soft power also in other areas. And this is mainly true, I dare say, for South America these very days, but it's in general is very effective all over the place. This is another map. I mean, it's not very easy to find information, especially mapped information about these kinds of Belt and Road avenues and pillars, but these are some of them. So I may share with you. It's not mine, of course, it's from many other institutions around the world that have been gathering information on this. It's not impossible to find, but it's tricky. So the third avenue of cooperation, it's not a very recent one, but it's the most neglected, is the digital cum financial pillar, I would say. We know that the internet will shape everything: industry, manufacturing, transport, hospitals. Any kind of sector will be impacted by how much internet, which kind of internet, and which level of internet connectivity this sector will have. And China is very much aware of this. And she has been building the digital Silk Road. Again, originally nobody dared about because to talk about it, because it seemed to be only the Huawei story. But the Huawei story is just physical infrastructure, physical internet infrastructure, mostly. And it's been, I mean, in our view, it has been segmented. Instead, it's part of a big picture of digital connectivity, which also includes finance and currency. So I'm aware of this picture not being very sexy, not being very informative, but this is, you know, a net of central bank notes that is being put in place within what it's called a bridge. You know, multilateral currency, central bank digital currency bridge, which exactly has one Middle Eastern country participating, United Arab Emirates, together with Thailand, and with the supervision of the Bank for International Settlements, not least, to start using the new newly born electronic renminbi cross-border for cross-border payments, despite the vice central governor of the People's Bank of China saying some weeks ago that the ERMB is not going to be used for cross-border payments. It is going to be used. It is already being experimented in a pilot bridge dedicated to this, and one of these countries is the United Arab Emirates. So again, which is, let me say, much more relevant in terms of financial linkages than the other country participating in the bridge pilot project, namely Thailand, because of course the much larger flows of resources that flow from China to United Arab Emirates and back, compared to those from and back to Thailand. So the pilot is going to test whether ERMB can be used for international transactions. And of course, this is very much connected to the digital Silk Road, because the payments will be digitalized as well with the ERMB. And the countries that will have been partnering with China also on the digital Silk Road will be much ahead of time in this, you know, new adventure with China. So I realize this digital Silk Road is not very fascinating. I mean, it's very technical. It's very complicated. It's banking, finance, and information technology altogether, which, I mean, none of them is very, you know, reader friendly for non-specialists. But altogether, these three sectors are joining forces to build something that we cannot tell about yet, because it seems that China wants to build a kind of a digital realm, including many countries in the world, not just neighboring countries, such as Indonesia, which is one of the most, near to being included into this digital projects, but also United Arab Emirates, for example. Not only, but already officially included in the pilot. This, I think, opens at least an expectation of a potential digital area, cross-border, where internet regulation, e-commerce regulation, and the digital sector regulation will be shared, and which will likely to be segmented from other areas where other rules will be applied to either e-commerce or digital sector or internet. And I think that the world should not be hoping for a segmented internet, because internet is exactly beneficial for everybody, because it's free and it's interoperable. The very day we will have different internets, then that will be a very, very gloomy day, I think. So I think the scenario cannot be built, but we have two options at least. One is for a free internet, and the other is for a segmented internet. And finance will be included into this, because finance will be digitalized, and so we'll go through the usual avenues through that our mobiles are bearing with them, so all the connections. And so, sorry, Alex, for not giving you a scenario, but we have two major scenarios. We are, I think, on a very crucial moment where the international financial governance people and fora should be very much aware that we are now at the very crucial juncture for this. But let me end my couple of minutes with a comment going back to what I was saying before. After Africa and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, I believe, is becoming the area where all the Belt and Roads are being developed, and in a very comprehensive way. I think in the spring, it is a spring tour in 6 countries in the area. Chinese Foreign Ministry Wang Yi mentioned, and was also very much commented upon that very statement, that China is very much aware of the area, because of course she was still helping developing countries to develop their much needed infrastructure. And this is very peculiar indeed, because the area we are talking about is not a developing area. So being a developing economist working on Asia and on China, working in developing countries, I was kind of shocked hearing not just Mr. Foreign Minister, but also commentators saying that this developing area needs a lot of development cooperation, because of course Saudi Arabia is not the low-income country, United Arab Emirates neither. And so I think that this, of course, is not a mistake. Well, it's an economic mistake, but it's not a political mistake, because I think it's intended to include the area in the broader narrative of China becoming the leader of developing nations, wanting to help them develop their own internet, health, financial, transport, and digital infrastructure also ever. So all the networks of connectivity of the future are included in the development, say, cooperation, and including countries which are not developing countries, but are high-income countries or middle-income countries. So I think that this narrative is very powerful. It's being sold to developing countries, of course, very effectively. We have seen how many, partners and friends China's been gathering around the least developed countries, and how much China's foreign lending has been growing in these least developed countries. But also for an area like, the GCC or the Middle East altogether, but the GCC more specifically, being included in the narrative of developing countries, I would inquire about, at least myself. So I throw on the floor for the discussion this very point, because I think that narratives are shaping our time. Of course, we are entrapped into two different narratives, very confrontational. We have a Washington narrative and Beijing narrative. I would very much hope that there's another narrative around, and I hope that all these discussions can help build another one, maybe more quiet. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much, Alessia. We will see now from the floor what our public is going to ask us. I see already several questions and raised hand. Please raise your digital hand, and then you will be invited to unmute yourself. As you mentioned, and as basically all our four speakers mentioned, connectivity and different dimensions of the BRI are playing in the Gulf right now, but also, as Alessia, you're mentioning about two competing narratives, what I see as a glooming picture, gazing at the crystal ball, is this separation, decoupling of digital ecosystem. Then it's going to be a huge problem, not only for global business, but for every individual. Having said that, I just open the floor to the question. We have a hand from Hatun Al-Fassi. Please just unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you. And I invite all the other speakers to just turn on the webcam, so we are all on the panel. Okay, Hatun, the floor is yours if you want to ask the question. In the meantime, if there are some technical issue, I just read the question.
Hello.
Please.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly. The floor is yours.
Okay, sorry for that. Thank you for this interesting panel. My question is to Jackie. Thank you, Jackie, for this fascinating presentation. My question is regarding an absent element of the Chinese Gulf relations, if we would call it as such, which is the Uyghur minority in the Muslim minority in China. And we know that there are very hard issues of the Uyghurs with the Chinese state, government, but we don't see that reflected by any means or any way in their relationship with the Gulf. So I was wondering, why is that, and is there something else to the story? Is there a role that they should play in these relations? And I'll leave it to you, Jackie, to enlighten us with this issue.
Unfortunately, there really isn't too much to enlighten anybody on this issue. It is so sensitive that literally, as you've pointed out, there is no government in the Gulf willing to publicly, at least, question China about what's going on in Xinjiang. And as somebody based in China right now, I am not going to discuss what's happening in Xinjiang. And I don't see, and then when, I mean, I think obviously there are countries that speak out for, for good reason. And then there are countries who speak out for reasons that feeds into Chinese nationalism. So it is so sensitive that I don't see, unfortunately, any progress being made on this issue anytime soon. And I honestly can't think of any particular government in the world which is try to address this in a way that actually might be effective?
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I'm just moving to another question that we just received now in the Q&A. It's a very specific question, and it's from Alexander Karapiperis. Please, can you elaborate further from Qatar talk to make Chinese firm PetroChina and Sinopec equity stake partner in its liquefied natural gas expansion project? Can we consider that as a shift of Qatari reliance on Western measure for technology and global outreach? If someone of the can address the question.
I'm happy to address it in a general sense, and maybe someone else might want to come in on that as well. I can't speak to this very specific case, but what I can speak to is a broader trend of the way that the Gulf states have attempted to secure their market share in and to defend their market share in key markets and in key economies as far as their energy exports are concerned. And so I think the underlying logic, and that tells you quite a bit about the sense of Saudi and Emirati investments, not only in China, but also in India and other major Asian markets that buy their energy exports, is that these are a way of locking in these buyer-seller relationships for the long term, especially in an environment that is characterized by a glut in global energy supplies and shortages and global energy demands, partly due to the slowing economic activity, which in part has been worsened by the global COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it's not a new thing to bring in, for the Gulf states to bring in Asian investors into their energy projects. The UAE has done it with ONGC, the Dish, for example, an Indian state-owned oil company. The Iranians have tried to do it as well. For the most part, these companies are brought in through joint ventures and so on without the Gulf states, because there still is a degree of resource nationalism. So the Gulf states are not, ceding control or ownership of, for the most part, although Bahrain seems to be changing its policies somewhat, that there are indications that Bahrain might start offering ownership of oil in the ground and of shale oil in the ground. Because of the difficulties in extracting shale oil, you need to incentivize foreign investors to do that. But as a general rule, the Gulf states have not, to my knowledge, taken to conceding or ceding ownership of the oil resources, even though they might offer stakes in different oil companies and so on. But this broader idea of bringing on Asian investors is not new. And the underlying logic of much of the Gulf states' investment decisions has been to lock in these buyer-seller relationships for the long term, so as to defend their market share, as I said, in an environment characterized by oversupply in energy. I'll just say a few words to respond to Hatun's, I think, very interesting question as well, if I may. I think so the Gulf states have not been entirely silent about the Uyghur issue. We've seen statements by the Kuwaiti parliament, we've seen statements by parliament in Bahrain, and funny enough, the statement by the Bahraini parliament was actually immediately picked up by the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo at the time, who tweeted it and said, yes, there is resistance to China and there's condemnation of what China is doing. Even though it wasn't, the Bahraini statement was not framed in very aggressive terms. But I think the takeaway point is that I think there has been a shift in the foreign policy strategies of the Gulf states, and particularly Saudi Arabia, away from championing transnational Muslim causes. So Saudi Arabia no longer, I think, under the leadership of Crown Prince Mohammad bin Salman, no longer sees itself, is no longer very interested in playing the role of global champion of transnational Muslim causes. And so it's not going to ruin its relationship with China over the Uyghur issue, or with India over Kashmir, or over the treatment of Muslim minorities in India. I think this is a broader trend that speaks to a broader shift in the foreign policy strategies of Gulf states. I think they're more interested, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are more interested in acting as, and Saudi Arabia, of course, as a G20 power, as important regional normal states, so to speak, than to play the role of a champion of transnational Muslim causes. I think we're seeing that shift. It's not a very easy one, because it means that you leave vacuums here and there for other players, such as Turkey, for example, to fill in, or as far as Kashmir is concerned. But even a player like Turkey, which has more compelling domestic political reasons to express sympathy with the plight of Uyghur Muslims in China, finds it very difficult to do so because of what China is able to do in terms of the BRI, because of the economic incentives that exist in the Chinese relationship, because of China's, let's say, readiness to inflict pain on those who dare cross the three Chinese red lines, being, Xinjiang and the domestic issues being one of them, not to mention Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Hassan. I have other couple of questions from the floor. I will try to merge both questions. Is the recent violence erupted between Israel and Hamas? Is it going to create a problem for the future of the Abraham Accord, and how China, or if China, is going to play a role as a mediator? And this is open to all our speakers. Jonathan, if you want to start to jump in.
Sure. So, yeah, when Wang Yi was in Neom meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman back in March, he had made a statement that China was willing to meet with, how did he phrase it? It was an interesting turn of phrase. I think it was just public figures from Palestine and Israel. So he didn't specify officials, but it was public figures, to invite them to China to try to initiate some kind of talks on Israel and Palestine. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because it was held, I think, the day after the last round of elections in Israel, so nobody's paying any attention. It just seemed like, a piece of low-hanging fruit. And I think in this, China was trying to offer itself as an alternative, where the US was clearly aligned with Israel, where under the Trump administration, the Palestinians had really been given short shrift. And China has always portrayed itself as a leader of the global south, of the third world. And to this end, Palestine has always been an issue that Chinese leaders have kind of clung to in the Middle East as a way of developing support in the Arab world. This is good for a couple of reasons, but one maybe cynical reason is that the Arab world has a lot of voices in the United Nations or other global forums. So by speaking to Arab publics in this way, it certainly endears China to a lot of countries that can help it in multilateral forums. But at the same time, if you look at everything China does with Israel and Palestine, it's clearly economically weighed much more heavily towards the Israelis than the Palestinians, where China is doing a lot of investment, as Hassan mentioned. There's a lot of technology transfer. They're working on COVID and AI stuff. The economic footprint with the Palestinians is basically selling a lot of consumer goods and essentially choking the Palestinian economy. So, I think it's a little disingenuous for China to portray itself as a mediator in this issue. For one reason, I don't think anybody in Palestine or Israel sees China as a serious as a serious actor in this. They don't really have a history there. They don't have a deep pool of diplomatic actors that can talk to both sides. This isn't something China really can do. And they've made this offer many times in the past, and nobody's really taken it very seriously. As to the Abraham Accords, I don't think it's going to really have a fundamental impact. I think everybody probably was expecting something like this to happen. It's unfortunately a pretty common feature in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. I think all the Arab countries that have been engaging with Israel did this with their eyes open. I think the UAE obviously has made statements that it sees an opportunity to play a role in some kind of solution at this point. So maybe rather than seeing it as something that might threaten the normalization, I think it's probably something that's, I think it's probably seen as a bump in the road, a longer road.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And we have also another question from Iman El Alami, considering risk. Alami asks, considering the instability and the Middle Eastern region, isn't that risky and challenging to the effectiveness of the BRI? Which measures are taken by China to cope with this unstable environment in order to promote its stability, which is essential to the success of the BRI? Alessia, if you want to answer this question.
Yes, thank you. Well, it is an issue, but also a non-issue, depending on how we see and how we consider the Belt and Road. As far as transports are concerned, of course, instability or energy, securing is concerned. Instability is an issue. But as far as finance, digital, and else, well, not so much so. So, and on top of that, all the other areas where the Belt and Road is making inroads are very unstable on various grounds. So I think that this question is very pertinent, of course, but the Belt and Roads are many and very diversified. So they can find their own way, regardless of whether instability comes from some field or another. And I think this is the very nutshell of how Belt and Road was developed and designed from scratch. So not being linked too much to one avenue of connectivity, but building avenues, many avenues for connectivity, so that if one, is bumpy, then the other goes much faster. So I think that yes and no are both right as an answer. It's very complex, not complicated, but it's very complex networks of connectivity. And also the immaterial avenues of connectivity are gaining importance exactly because most physical connectivity links are maybe cumbersome somewhere.
Thank you, Alessia. We have still two raised hand from Kedar and Yasser, but first, let me see if maybe Jonathan or Hassan, you want to jump in with a very quick remark.
Sure, just very quickly on the BRI in the Middle East. I mean, sure, if you look at the Middle East as a whole, it does look like a region of turbulence or instability, but you will see pockets of stability. And again, if you see places where China's investing, where it's developing ports or industrial parks, this seems to be the physical architecture of its Belt and Road in the region. And they've announced certain projects, the Khalifa port here in Abu Dhabi, Duqm in Oman, the Jazan industrial park in Saudi. All these things are kind of linking these business clusters and supply chains around the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean. So I think what China is doing is just targeting those areas where it's going to get the most bang for its buck, where it's going to be, havens of stability in a rather turbulent region. And I think it's actually been a pretty sophisticated approach.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And we start for another question from the floor. Kader Neupane, apologies if I pronounce wrong your family name. Please be so kind to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I have a brief question because as we see the Belt and Road now has 3 or 4 dimensions. One is economics and the other one is digital. As I hear from the speakers, in both areas, looks like China has made a lot of inroads in Asia, Africa, and now have entered into Middle East. And at the same time, the human rights issues of Xinjiang was not a big agenda in the US policies in the past. Now the rhetoric has gone up. My question is it a new way by the West to galvanize Muslim community to condemn China's interference, or what is the strategy? Because it looks like they're losing on the economics and the digital. what is the gut feeling? I just wanted to have anybody who panels can share us an idea. Thank you very much.
The floor is yours if someone wants to jump in first.
I'm happy to do so very quickly. I mean, I don't know if it's part of an explicit US strategy to galvanize global Muslim condemnation of China, but I think if it were, it wouldn't be a very successful one. I think because most of the major, as we said, I mean, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are not interested in ruining their relations with China on account of what they perceive and now frame as being a Chinese. Nor are other countries like Pakistan, for example, or Indonesia or other big players in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, big Muslim majority states, interested or capable of playing such a role. I mean, Pakistan is a major recipient of Chinese investments and aid and lending. Indonesia and the Southeast Asian players are also have relations that are deeply intertwined with China. Turkey, as we said, is also a major destination and an important node in China's Belt and Road Initiative. And so China has created, either by default or by design, has managed to create deep-founded, well-established relations with most of the big Muslim majority countries across the world. And I think the economic and the security and the trade-off is too large for them, I think, to take a strong stand on what they view as domestic, squarely Chinese domestic issues.
Thank you, Hassan, for your answer. And we have just the right time for the last question from the floor, from Yasser Al-Qassemi. Yasser, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you for this interesting panel. I'd like just to ask, given that China is ready to sell military drones and missiles when United States or Europe hesitate providing this sophisticated technology, I'd like to ask if in the future we could see military Chinese bases in the Gulf as a strategy for the GCC to diversify allies, and in the same time for China an opportunity to protect its interests in the region, above all the oil tankers. Thank you.
I think everybody can have a shot at this question, and we can start with Jonathan, then Alessia, Hassan, and Jacqueline.
Sure. I'm actually, when we finish here, I'm going to get back to writing an article about this topic. So I'll try to be brief, but it's going to be tough. I think on the one hand, it's reasonable to expect that given the depth of China's interests and its expatriate population, and the fact that tensions with China and the US kind of dictate that China can't rely on US providing security for Chinese interests in the long term. But at the same time, the way I think Beijing would look at it is by trying to build a base, say in Oman or wherever in the Gulf, this would be an overt challenge to US preponderance in the region. And you can say, as Hassan pointed out, a lot of countries do have deeper footprints in the security realm. A lot of Asian countries do, but the difference is those countries are all US allies or partners, where China is the chief competitor. So I think Beijing's actually looked at this and thought the cost of antagonizing the US isn't worth it. And I think also the other calculation is knowing that, if China were to go to the Saudis and say, hey, we want to build a base in Neom, then this would put the Saudis in a tremendously difficult situation in their own relationship with their main security partner. So I think for the time being, until the situation deteriorates between China and the US to the point where they can't, I imagine Beijing would be far more satisfied to maintain the situation as it is, to not be overtly challenging US preponderance in the region, and using things like its supply base in Djibouti and whatever Gwadar turns out to be in Pakistan as a way to project power in the region without having an actual base in the Gulf. Thanks.
Alessia, if you have something to add.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Well, you know that I'm not a security person at all. But one thing I can say is that the PLA has also, you know, used new tools of, say, aid, military aid and diplomacy, so to say, during the COVID. There's been a lot of countries, especially in the area, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, Russia, Argentina, and many other countries, who received military aid and donations. So it's not exactly the standard traditional way of, you know, building or finding its own way in foreign countries, but it's a way to test, and, you know, the ability of building relations in a different way. This is a view from a non-security person about the donations the PLA gave to many countries during the pandemic, and that may go on because the pandemic is not over. We will have new versions of COVID, and the network of donations will still be in place.
Jacqueline, if you want to add something, and then we have Hassan.
Yes, I do think that the PLA has carried out some military training. I mean, minor and very specific, but they have carried out some military training in the Gulf. And one thing now I'm interested in looking at is to see to what extent there have been specific scholarships set aside for people from the Gulf to attend various military universities in China.
Hassan, the floor is yours for the closing remark.
Thank you very much. I broadly agree. I don't with what Jonathan has said, and I think I like to look at the broader, the really big trends. And I think the big trend is that if the US manages to set aside its differences with Iran and arrive at some form of a nuclear arms control agreement that builds on JCPOA 1.0, then I think really the imperative for the US to remain focused on the Gulf is going to decrease. And I think over the long term, of course, given the background of great power competition, it's most likely, and we're already seeing this in the national security strategies, not only of the US and the biggest sort of global players, but even in middle powers strategies such as the UK Defense Review, is that the Indo-Pacific is now becoming a much more important theater of great power competition. Now, the question is, what are the implications of that for the Gulf states? And I think the way I tend to see this is that there are differential gains to be made by different Gulf states with great power competition, sort of shifting the spotlight onto the Indo-Pacific. So countries like Oman, primarily because of its strategic location, but also Yemen, Saudi Arabia, because it straddles both the Gulf and the Red Sea, and Yemen, and the UAE. In essence, really the IOR littoral states and the southern sort of Gulf states are going to be the biggest beneficiaries of that shift away from a focus on the Gulf and more to the Indian Ocean region. Now, China does not have a natural advantage. Geographically, India, for example, is much better placed to dominate that part of it, not to dominate at least, but at least to play a more decisive security role in that zone. But China has some advantages going for it. It's positioning itself as an important partner for the Gulf states in areas of emerging technology. It manages to leverage its economic capabilities in places like Djibouti to acquire a strategic footprint. It's much more agile and dexterous than in its ability to formulate and implement policy than India, for example. And so it remains to be seen, but I think there are differential gains and to be made from these big trends. I don't see China swooping in and overtly trying to harass the US in the Gulf theater, primarily because this is not going to be the main arena of great power competition. It's it's a bit more further to the south and to the east.
And with this word, Hassan, please allow me to thank all our audience who have been with us. We just run out just a few minutes later, but all the questions were very on point and informative and interesting. A great thanks to all our speakers for having devoted their time to being with us today. And I hope you are going to have a great day. Thank you very much. And please, last but not least, allow me to thank the MEI and ISPI media team for making this event possible. Thank you and have a great day. Ciao.